Welcome to Context. I'm Bakhtiar Aslanov, and today we focus on a dangerous new escalation in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, one that may now be entering a far more volatile chapter. In the wake of Ukraine's unprecedented drone attack on Russian airfields last weekend, President Vladimir Putin has vowed retaliation, and in a revealing follow-up, Kremlin advisors, alongside individuals close to U.S. President Donald Trump, have warned of a rising risk of nuclear confrontation. Following a phone call between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump on Wednesday, Trump stated, quote, "President Putin did say, and very strongly, that he will have to respond to the recent attack on the airfields." The quote has already sent ripples through Washington and European capitals, raising fresh concerns about whether the U.S. commitment to Ukraine is being too shifted. To unpack these developments, we are joined by Anna Evans, a political analyst based in Lisbon, Portugal. Her insights will help us better understand what's at stake and what might come next. Anna, thank you for being with us and welcome to Context.
Thank you, Bakhtiar. Good to see you.
Good. Anna, let's begin with Ukraine's drone attack on Russian airfields. How significant is this moment tactically and symbolically in the broader war?
Well, this is a very important moment for a number of reasons. First of all, because it shows that Ukraine had the strategic capacity to go far into Russian land and attack from within Russian land and very next to those air bases that were supposed to be heavily guarded. And so this is, in military terms, this is a very, very special operation with a very meaningful impact in terms of the capacity to go far away into enemy land. So this is one item why it's so important. And this item, of course, impacts the perspective of Russians domestically, because it shows that Ukraine can actually go inside Russia, and psychologically, this is really major from the point of view of the Russians themselves, of the citizens. So it's not very good news for President Putin and for his regime, to publicly confront this incursion into the deep Russia. Now, there's also another very important item regarding what this means, this attack to the air bases and the bombers. This also means that at the current stage, the use of drones has become so important in terms of military operations. And it's a kind of the arisal of a new form of guerrilla war in terms of drones. Some international analysts are calling it the new drone guerrilla. Why? Because these are air bases that have highly sophisticated anti-aerial, anti-missile defense systems, and also some more recent anti-drone defense systems. But still, there are these drones that are very easily maneuverable and not very high cost, and which can be used and go through all the layers of air defenses. And so this is like a new fashion of drone war, which requires that not only Russia, but other big armies around the world accept that this is a new way of warfare. And so this means for other armies around the world that they need to now shift training and the kinds of equipment and acquire new technologies and prepare all the resources to defend from this new line of drone warfare. And so it has much broader consequences than just, the concrete attack inside Russia. It tells us that at the world level, the great armies need to prepare new resources for this kind of air, air drone, apparently non-sophisticated but very effective guerrilla. And so it has many, many implications. And obviously, this is forcing President Putin to tell its domestic audiences, his domestic audiences, that the Russian Federation has the capacity to retaliate or something like this. So it's an attack that has been, really major, devastating at the very, very core of the government system and, the military apparatus in Russia. We also know that it's calculated that around 1/3 of Russian bombers with nuclear capacity are gone or nearly dismantled as a consequence of this attack. And although these bombers represent a small percentage of the nuclear capacity of the country as a whole, because there's also submarine nuclear capacity and land nuclear capacity, still this means that it will not be easy to repair the damage that has been done in terms of air nuclear capacity on the side of Russia. Again, it's not very good news for the Russian Federation.
Anna, in terms of international law and norms, how is Ukraine's use of long-range drones against Russian territory being interpreted globally, especially in Europe?
Well, in Europe, there has been a very, very intense criticism against Russia's use of drones to attack civilian populations and residential areas. So Russia's ongoing attacks, and as you know, these drone attacks by Ukraine on the air bases and the bombers were themselves already a sequence, a retaliation to previous attacks by Russian bombers and also drones that hit residential areas in Ukraine. But there's a big difference here from the European point of view and also from the international law point of view, the humanitarian law that is involved or infringed by Russia's direct hitting of residential areas is a very, very serious breach of international law. Whereas Ukraine's attack on air bases and on air bombers is an attack on military. It's a very precise attack on military facilities and equipment that is actually being used at the war. So the planes, one can see from the footage of the flames that the planes had a lot of fuel and were operating. And so these are planes that were being used at war in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And it is a direct target, a very specific target on military equipment. So it's a whole different range of issues involved between hitting military targets or hitting civilian and residential targets, which is unfortunately what has been happening for quite a while with the intensification of Russian attacks to Ukraine, including during the unfortunately failed negotiations that have taken place in Istanbul already twice.
Anna, what do you think Putin gains strategically by publicizing or leveraging his communications with Donald Trump right now?
Well, Bakhtiar, I think it's always good for both Putin and Trump, for both presidents, to show their domestic constituencies and their international partners that they are both at a high standing, high-level diplomacy and talking together. So on the one hand, President Putin shows that Russia is sufficiently powerful and he personally is sufficiently influential to have direct voice, a direct line with President Trump.
Yes.
And vice versa, same thing. So it is also a show of force in the sense of capacity to talk directly, to pick up the phone and talk. You know, these two world leaders. Now, it is not very good news for President Trump when he says, and he did say clearly after his phone call with President Putin, President Trump said clearly that this is not going to lead to peace. So it's obvious that President Trump's promises that he would end the war, the Ukraine war, in 24 hours is obviously, unfortunately for all of us, not a fulfilled promise. On the contrary, he is now stating very clearly that the war is not going to stop. On the contrary, it all, indicates that it is escalating. Nevertheless, I would like to point out that there is a very small detail that President Trump has referred and which might have been overlooked by the press as a whole, and which is, I believe, very important also in the Russian-Ukrainian affair, which is the nuclear talks with Iran. You know, President Trump has mentioned after his phone call with President Putin that the two of them discussed the Iranian nuclear talks. And this is important because, as we know, Russia might have a role to play if the talks with Iran go well in terms of being a guardian of the enriched uranium. So there is a role for Russia here, and these things end up being connected. So any benefits that Russia can be offered on the Middle East side are calculated for other interests and national interests on the other Russian front fields. So we should also, I think, take into account that the politics of the Middle East could now play a role in what comes next, also on the Russian side.
Anna, to what extent does this development strain NATO unity, especially if Putin's retaliation spills over into neighboring states?
Bakhtiar, I would say that the probability that Putin's retaliation goes further, goes to, hit directly NATO states, I would say the probability is relatively low, because that would mean that NATO states, by treaty, deploy all the mechanisms of collective defense. And so this would bring Russia to war with NATO. And if we think how much Russia did for 3 years during the Second World War and how much is happening now for 3 years, to me, it sounds rather obvious that Russia does not have the capacity to withstand a war with NATO. And so I would say I would certainly not expect Russia to cross that red line because the consequences would be rather dramatic. And I don't think that would be something that President Putin wants for Russia.
And finally, what scenarios do you foresee unfolding in the short to medium term? And what would you advise European policymakers to prioritize in managing these rapidly evolving crises?
Well, it looks like, again, Europe does not have as much leverage here as China has. Because in my view, China has the cards. It is really the country that is supplying Russia at this point. And so the discussions need to imperatively address China's interests. So, for example, there is now a legislation about to be submitted to the US Congress that foresees a 500% tax on third countries that buy gas and oil from Russia. And that would, for example, hit China. Because China, as we know, is selling, is buying oil from Russia and buying a lot of energy from Russia.
Yes.
But some European countries still buy energy from Russia. And Russia, as we know, is a major player at the world level in the energy field. And so I would say that this is a really long shot, because I wouldn't expect something like this to pass easily in the US Congress. But it is also a long shot for Europe to expect that the sanctions will work, because we've had so many rounds of sanctions and they have not worked yet.
Yes.
So I would not expect European sanctions, further rounds of sanctions, to really make that much difference, because it is, in the end, it is China that holds the real cards of sustainable Russia in industrial and military and economic terms.
Yeah.
I would also say that European policymakers should mind a lot about the Middle East, because there are some Russian interests in the Middle East that could be contemplated in a scenario of negotiations. And I am sure that the United States is doing this in the negotiations, with President Putin. But I would say that whatever can be negotiated with the Russian Federation really goes through third parties and not necessarily something that is only focused on Ukraine.
Anna Evans, thank you for your thoughtful and incisive analysis today. We deeply appreciate your time and expertise here on Context. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bahtiar.
Thank you. And to our audience, thank you for joining us. We will continue to track the evolving dynamics of the Ukraine war and the geopolitical rifts it's creating across continents. Until next time, stay informed and stay safe.